question that you really were not expecting an answer to. That maybe you were trying to, figure out what someone is really up to, or maybe you were trying to trap them in a way to show them that they weren't, or show others that they weren't quite what this person is claiming to be. Well, that's the kind of question that the Sadducees came to Jesus to ask. They want to trap Jesus. They want to trip him up. He's got way too many followers. Too many people consider him to be something important, someone important. And the Sadducees want to try to expose him as a trickster. And so they ask this question thinking that he's going to look pretty foolish because he's going to really struggle to answer this question. You see, the Sadducees do not believe in the resurrection. And one of the reasons that they don't is because the Sadducees had as their scripture the first 5 books called the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And nowhere in those first 5 books of the Bible is resurrection mentioned. And so the Sadducees consider that there is no such thing as resurrection because it's not in their scripture. As the old joke goes, they do not believe in the resurrection that makes them sad, you see. It's a good way to remember. So when they ask Jesus this question about whose husband or whose wife is this woman going to be after 7 or 8 men have had her as a wife, they're expecting him to kind of stumble and have no way of answering. And if you notice, Jesus doesn't really answer their question, but he turns it into a teaching moment. What's important to Jesus is that there isn't going to be the same sort of life that there is here. And some of us may go, whew, when we think about that. And that people are not really going to be married. There was a different understanding in that time about marriage. It wasn't the romantic understanding that we have now that you get married because you love the other person and you want to be with them the rest of your life. Marriage was more of a property sort of thought. Women, think about it. She's passed to brother, to brother, to brother. They were more thought of as commodity instead of people of worth. Well, if she is no one's wife in the resurrection, she is a child of God on her own and is part of the resurrection on her own. Well, that may sound a little strange to our ears and it may sting, especially as Jesus talks about God is the God of the living and not the dead. What about our relationships now? Does that mean that the relationships that we are in now do not continue after we die? Does that mean that our relationship with God, if God is the God of the living and now we are dead, does that mean that those are over? Well, that's not what Jesus is really teaching. He's also not teaching what life is exactly like, what heaven or the resurrected life is exactly like. But he's teaching that the relationships are there, but they're different. It's not about our being married to or being a piece of property, for lack of a better word, to someone else. It's that the relationship, if God knows us here and we know God here, God will know us forever and be with us forever. And so as Jesus is trying to explain that, God is the God of the living, he goes back to something from the first 5 books, the Torah, and he talks about Moses and the burning bush, and that's when God appears to Moses in this bush on fire that doesn't seem to be consumed, and Moses is extremely confused and has no idea who it is that's really speaking to him and says, "Who is this?" And God answers, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Jacob and the God of Isaac. I am, not I was, but I am. And so if God is the God of the I am, not the past, but of the living, and those three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are living with God, what Jesus is promising is that through our relationship with Jesus, we also live with God. There is no end to this life here. In other words, it is not the end. This is not all there is. There is more to come. And there's the great good news, is that we, in some way that we don't really know or don't quite understand, the relationships that we have here do somehow continue, especially that relationship with God. The God who is the God of the past, the God who is the God of the present, the God who is the God of the future forever. It's a concept that's hard to wrap our minds around. And I don't imagine that this teaching moment for the Sadducees helped convince them either. But it wasn't about convincing them. Because what was going to happen soon, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and what's going to happen soon is that they are going to be witnesses to Jesus dying. And yet, Jesus doesn't stay dead. On the third day, Jesus rises, and they are once again witness to Jesus' followers who have been changed forever, sharing the message, continuing to follow Jesus, continuing the message all the way down to us today. It's a message that has no end. It's a message, a relationship with God that had a beginning long before we were ever here, is present right now, and will be with us forever. That's the great good news. It's not a trick. It's not a moment of trying to convince us. It's a moment of faith that God gives us to trust.